From the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors, I'm Robert Casares, and this is The Reframe. My guest today is Dr. Bret Hendricks, past president of IAMFC. Dr. Hendricks is a professor and program coordinator in the counseling department at Texas Tech University. He's a licensed clinician and a board-approved supervisor in the state of Texas, and has nearly 20 years of counseling experience working with children and families in private practice, educational cooperatives, and children's group homes. Over the course of his career, Dr. Hendricks has endured many professional challenges, and he recounted some of the humorous and embarrassing moments he's experienced as a counselor.
There are lots of good counseling stories I could tell. I was doing group work with some clients in a group home, and we were trying to talk about social skills, and all of a sudden I was talking to a lady, and out of the corner of my eye I saw a movement, and I realized that there was a mouse that was crawling across the middle of the floor. And I heard some woman screaming and realized it was me. So the clients all got a big charge out of that. They thought that was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen, because once I pulled my legs down from clasping them in front of me in the chair, we all just had a good laugh about it. And I think that a lot of what I've done is I've just tried to have a sense of humor about things. And so I've enjoyed the work that I've done, and I've taken that attitude through the years.
Welcome to The Reframe. Over the next hour, you'll hear Dr. Hendricks describe the importance of embracing new professional challenges, share about the benefits of inviting honest feedback from trusted colleagues, and discuss how his clinical work has elevated his teaching and research. He also highlights the evolution of marriage and family counseling ethics and describes how previously many counselors viewed and applied ethical codes in a counterproductive way.
Honestly, I think that the way that we approach ethics has been really wrong in the past, and that it's been a punishment to counselors instead of looking at a way to really conceptualize our identities. So every single time I have to look at, when I'm sitting in front of the client, does that person have me fully there as a professional, and what does that mean in that context at that moment? And that changes from moment to moment. And really being fully invested in that client's growth, I have to be present. And so if I'm doing that and putting those clients' needs ahead of mine, then hopefully I'm doing the right things ethically.
I began our conversation by asking Bret to share about his work as a professor and program coordinator at Texas Tech.
Well, I am one of the very odd people that, and I don't mind counting myself among the odd people, that went through their entire degree program here at Tech, and then I was also hired by Texas Tech. So I finished my degree here at Texas Tech in 2000, and then I began my appointment at Texas Tech in 2002 as an assistant professor. And so I started, I had a little bit of experience between the time that I was, actually a lot of experience between the time that I graduated and the time that I started my job here at Tech. I did some adjunct work here at Tech, but in those 2 years between my degree and the time that I started, I served as clinical director at a children's home, and I also did private practice. And then I've been at Texas Tech ever since. And currently, I am full professor, and I'm also the coordinator of the counselor education program, and I'm the associate department chair for Ed Psych and leadership.
What would you say of those responsibilities kind of is your personal favorite or you find particularly rewarding?
Really, the thing that I find the most rewarding is two things. The private practice that I do, I find is extremely rewarding. And I don't think that I would really be able to survive in the field if I didn't do that. And then and I think that that links very clearly with my work here at Texas Tech. And then teaching. I love teaching. This semester I'm teaching 2 courses, and one is a intro ethics course that I have about 30 master's students in. And every week when I leave that course, I'm reminded why I enjoy doing what I am doing so much, because I just love teaching.
Well, you said that you wouldn't be able to survive as a professor if you weren't doing clinical work. Tell me more about how your clinical work informs your work as a counselor educator.
You know, I have this idea that I really think that if I'm teaching and this is just personal, I'm not putting this on anybody else, but for me, to be really effective as a teacher, I feel like that I need to be doing what I'm talking about. And what I see in clinical work is that things change so rapidly. Presenting issues have changed through the years, diagnostics, even down to where I'm looking at ethical dilemmas, not only in direct clinical work, but in billing, in informed consent, and all those areas. And every day that I go in to do private practice is a challenge. And those challenges that I encounter there then inform how I teach in the classroom.
Yeah, that's something that I hear from students a lot is almost that assumption that by the time you make it to the level of, being licensed or being a professor, that somehow you've kind of got all the answers or it's much more easy to navigate complicated ethical dilemmas. And for someone who's experienced as you are, both as a clinician and as an educator, it seems like that's never really the case.
Absolutely. I tell my students that I very rarely end a session where I don't feel the need to call somebody and consult and say, did I do the right thing? I think that we always need to be seeking, even if we are on top of our game, so to speak, and really practicing within our lane and using good theoretical constructs, I still think we can make ourselves better, and that's what I always look for after a session is did I do the best thing for the clients? And so for me, every day that I go in to teach, I can talk about those dilemmas. And of course, I don't use any identifying data, but I talk about the emotions underlying what I'm doing and some of the constructs that I use in terms of questioning my own efficacy as a counselor.
Yeah, that reminds me of an article you wrote for the Family Journal about 10 years ago. And in that article, you talk about how counselors have essentially become conditioned to behave ethically because they're so afraid of potential legal consequences or punishments. And so I just wanted to read an excerpt from that article that you wrote in the Family Journal entitled, Who Are We? The Role of Ethics in Shaping Counselor Identity. And in that article, you write, I believe, as many of you believe, that counseling is not something we simply do. Counseling is who we are. It's an identity. It's an integral part of our personalities, and counseling is something we live. We are called to be facilitative to our clients and to each other. Ethics provide us with a framework to practice the craft we love. Ethics is a unifying factor, not a set of rules used to traumatize and fragment our profession.
Honestly, I think that the way that we approach ethics has been really wrong in the past, and that it's been a punishment to counselors instead of looking at a way to really conceptualize our identities. So every single time I have to look at when I'm sitting in front of the client, does that person have me fully there as a professional, and what does that mean in that context at that moment? And that changes from moment to moment. And really being fully invested in that client's growth, I have to be present. And so if I'm doing that and putting those clients' needs ahead of mine, then hopefully I'm doing the right things ethically.
Well, you mentioned the value and necessity of consultation. I'm curious about what role consultation plays in terms of affirming whether or not you've done the right thing, and if that allows you in future sessions to be a bit more present because you've kind of rounded out your perspective by consulting with another professional.
I have several people with whom I consult, with whom I really trust, or whom I really trust to consult regarding client situations. I think that um, first anybody has to be aware of the person's credentials with whom they're consulting. And so I've got a cadre of several people here that I feel very confident that I can consult with, and I trust their judgment. And so as I consult with them, you know, this is I tell my students and others that you have to have those people that'll tell you if you've got spinach in your teeth. And these are my people. And so if I walk out of a session and feel like, man, I think I did okay, but I'm not sure. And did I really, what did I miss here? And I call these folks and they tell me, yeah, you kind of screwed up there. And it's not an ethics thing, it's a best practice thing. And the nice thing is that I'm not afraid to talk with these folks about where I did potentially mess up. And I think that that's one of the things that you have to have that's the biggest ingredient for me with consult. Of course, they have to be qualified to do what they're doing and to consult. But secondly, do I really trust them? And are they going to really hold me accountable? And I do the same with them. So it's a give and take relationship that I have with several of these people.
Well, it sounds like that's one of those relationships where, as you get a different perspective, it's not something that calls you to question your ability to deliver effective services, but something that really kind of affirms and helps you to appropriately evaluate, the work that you are doing.
Absolutely. It does affirm, hopefully. There are times when any of us don't do the right thing in a counseling session. And I think that one of the things that I really am concerned about in the counseling field is that clinicians many times are afraid to admit that they possibly didn't do the right thing. And so, for me, again, it's a matter of survival. It helps me with burnout. It helps me to prioritize uh, what my real goals are for each of the counseling sessions. But it also gives me a safety net to come back and say, did I really do the right thing?
Well, the way you talk about that as something that's necessary for your ongoing effectiveness, but also as a best practice, is something that oftentimes is a struggle for students. Maybe they're really good academically, but the idea of blending that art and science of counseling is a bit more complicated. How do you communicate to students how important it is to be able to self-evaluate and say, or hear from another person, that didn't go to plan or that could have been better?
I think that we really do strive in our program to communicate with students that they're going into a field where they'll be constantly evaluated. And so we make that part of our orientation from day one in our master's program. But then in each of my classes that I teach, we talk about that perfection is an awfully difficult mark to hit. And so there are always things that we can do to improve. It doesn't mean we're doing things wrong, but it means that we can improve. Therefore, I encourage students to always be open to feedback, that there's a difference between feedback and criticism per se, and that your work is going to be on view as you go through the program. And then, more importantly, as you begin clinicals and even as you begin practice, your work is on view with the public in terms of the clients that you serve and the entities that you serve. So we're always being evaluated. And I think in a world right now, we see a spirit of everybody gets a cookie after every softball game. And I'm being facetious about that, but we have to really instill in our students that not everybody gets a trophy, that they really will be realistically evaluated, and that that's for their own good and for the good of the public as well. And Rob, the other piece to that too is that I don't think that we can do effective critical analysis of our students' work unless we're also giving a lot of encouragement to their work. I think it's really important that I first frame things in terms of strengths based, that I look at the student's talents, I look at the student individually, I look at what they can bring to the client, personality wise, talent wise, skill wise. And so, really, in terms of criticism, I frame that with the students in terms of that we're honing their craft, that we're focusing them in the best way that they can approach clients. Therefore, it's not just criticism, but it's a way for us to really help them to focus on who they are as counselors.
Well, tell me more about your work as a counselor educator. You mentioned earlier that diagnostic procedures may change or different issues with billing may change. Have you seen any changes in terms of the goals or aspirations or career interests of the students that you teach now?
In terms of the students I teach, first of all, I teach master's students who are primarily interested in clinical mental health. And so that's one set of students. And then I also work very closely with our PhD students. And so in terms of the master's students, I continue to see folks who have career aspirations that span a wide variety of interests. We have a large feeder here from a college on campus who does a lot of work with addictions, and so many of our students are coming through with an interest in addictions. And so a lot of our folks have uh, really wanted to work in the field of addictions. And then lately, simply because of opportunities we've had in the community, we're working very, very closely with correctional facilities. And so right now, I think I have probably well over half of our students who are doing internships and practica at correctional facilities here in town. And so that's been a real area of it hadn't been an area that we've expected to work with, but it's almost as if we're getting to be a specialty program in that area. And the students love it, and we love it for many reasons. We've got great supervision there, great opportunities for the students to work with the clients in that setting, and then just simple opportunistic stuff that the clients are always available. They live there, so it makes it easy for us to do our clinicals there. In terms of our PhD students, through the years, really, I've seen as far as career aspirations, most of our students want to go on and become counselor educators. And as far as just individual interests, I've seen the field switch from a lot of quantitative types of research to qualitative types. And I've had to make that shift myself. And then, of course, everybody is wanting to do work with trauma and issues around trauma now. So as far as focal points, I think that those are the main areas that we're looking at.
So, one of my hopes for this podcast is that it could be a forum for me to ask various experts in the field some of the questions that maybe I commonly get from students or from colleagues. And one of those questions that I get a lot from master's level students is, would it be better for me to graduate and go directly into a PhD program, or should I get some clinical experience before continuing my education? And I was curious what your thoughts on that were.
In our program, we really do give preference to students and we state this, that we give preference to students who've had a couple of years' experience. I believe that it's a matter of, and as we said earlier, of art and science. And I think that our students, the master's students, come out of their master's programs really pretty well prepared overall. As far as the science of counseling, the art, which I consider to be the more clinical aspects, I think it's really important for them to have some experience and to have the real world organic experience of working with clients, of working, indeed, of working with other professionals in the field, so that they have some of those things to bring into a doctoral program. And that also obviously enhances their abilities to do research and their ability to discern what their best research interests are going to be for them. So I highly recommend some years of experience before beginning a doctoral program.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful perspective because kind of the angle that I commonly hear is like, oh, that's just more time that I'm spending out of the classroom and it's delaying my degree. And it's seen as a disadvantage, where in reality, it's a tremendous advantage to gain that necessary experience. So I appreciate you sharing
Absolutely.
that perspective. Well, you mentioned how clinical work can inform a person's research, and you have a lot of diverse experiences, whether it be in children's group homes or private practice or even education cooperatives. What are some of your experiences professionally that kind of informed your interest in counseling ethics?
I'm sitting here kind of grinning because I really took the philosophy long ago that if I'm offered an opportunity, if a door opens, then I probably need to walk through the door and see what's on the other side. So I guess, I look at my clinical work and my experience in the field as a series of adventures. When I first started, I was a clinical coordinator for a children's home facility here that did foster care and adoption services. And so I was immediately, as I say, put into the deep end of the swimming pool because I had to deal with state entities and with very real abuse and trauma issues with children and adolescents. And I loved doing the work. I started to say, I hate to say it, but I loved it. I felt like that every day was a new opportunity. Many times I felt as if I was out of my depth. Thank goodness I had people around me who could help give me life preservers. But that just went on with a theme that I had of, if I am given a group to work with, I'm going to work with them. And so and again, I don't believe that you should do something that's outside your scope of training. I did have training to deal with these issues. But later, when I was also a clinical coordinator for a regional mental health consortium, we were doing state contracts. And as anybody in the field knows, that one day you're doing work with one group and the next day you're doing group with another. And so I walked in on a Monday and was told that I was going to be given all of the autism programs and the group home programs for intellectually disabled clients. And so I had some training in that, but it wasn't an area that I'd ever thought I'd focus on. And then all of a sudden I was in charge of 250 clients. And I loved it. I absolutely loved working with that population. And I think that my attitude has been that I feel, again, I feel empowered to work with these groups because I do think I've got good training. I've got good people with whom I can consult. And I look at it as an adventure. And so there are lots of good counseling stories I could tell where I had great times with those clients. One particular, I was doing group work with some clients in a group home, and we were trying to talk about social skills, and all of a sudden I was talking to a lady, and out of the corner of my eye I saw a movement, and I realized that there was a mouse that was crawling across the middle of the floor. And so I heard some woman screaming and realized it was me. And so the clients all got a big charge out of that. They thought that was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen, because once I pulled my legs down from clasping them in front of me in the chair, we all just had a good laugh about it. And I think that a lot of what I've done is I've just tried to have a sense of humor about things. People are people. And so I've enjoyed the work that I've done, and I've taken that attitude through the years.
You mentioned in particular not having a lot of counseling experience with treating individuals with autism. Were there additional trainings that you sought out in order to be perhaps more qualified or competent to treat that issue?
Absolutely. Prior to my being handed the program, I did some consultation in the area, so I've been really fortunate and blessed to be here with a great special education department or program right down the hall. So I was able to audit some courses. I also did training at conferences and sought out additional training in that area because I didn't feel like that I was well equipped for my master's degree. And even in the doctoral work I'd done, I didn't feel like I was well equipped. So I did seek out extra training.
And for clinicians coming up who want to seek out that training, what might be some of those more accessible or good resources they might try to look into?
The thing that I did was that we have a very, very strong autism program here at the university. And so I would always seek out any trainings that are done by professional associations. Those trainings were few and far between with regard to counseling associations. So I looked at the Autism Association. I looked at special ed trainings that were offered here in town regionally that provided CEUs. And then, as I say, I just went in and audited some courses so that I felt like I had extra training that I needed.
You mentioned earlier also how important it is to have a good sense of humor, and it seems like you really balance that sense of ongoing professional development and self-reflection with that light spirit of sense of humor. Are there other aspects of your work, either as a counselor educator or as a clinician, where you try and integrate humor?
I forgot who said this, but I'm trying to remember, and sometimes the brain doesn't work quickly. But you can either look at things and you can laugh or you can cry. And so I think that it's a real sign for me, for resilience, that I can laugh at things, and not in an irreverent way. But I think that there are just so many things that happen that are things we need to look at from a perspective of humor. What is life without humor? And so being able to have a sense of humor versus a sense of despair, especially in the times that we live in right now, I think it's absolutely vital. And it's also encouraging. People, when they're given the permission to actually look at the humor of a situation, I think it elevates it above some of the anxiety that we feel on things. It's hard to laugh and have anxiety at the same time.
You mentioned that it's hard to cry when you're laughing. One of the things that sometimes might make people want to cry when they think about it are the codes of ethics that we referenced earlier. And you were one of the co-authors of IAMFC's 2017 Code of Ethics. And I wonder if you could tell me about just what that process was like, determining, hey, we need to revise the previous ethical codes, and kind of what goes into that.
I actually started in 2011 and worked on the code of ethics that we had then with IMFC, went through that revision, and then also revised this last code. And I have to tell you that, number one, the field changes a lot in 6 years. And we thought naively, as we went in to revise the code in 17, that it would be a few simple updates and a few simple changes. And it was an entire rewrite from the ground up. It's a very long process, as you can well imagine, to update and write a code of ethics. And we gathered input from constituents, external and internal, from IMFC members, from clinicians in the field, from also people who inform legislation, from our board members. Then, once we did have a version that we felt comfortable with, we had input from our board of directors. Then it was sent to the ACA Ethics Committee, where they look at it, compare it to the ACA Ethics Code. And so it was really about a 3-year process.
Oh, wow.
From start to finish. Very extensive, very rewarding, but very extensive process.
Well, you mentioned how so much changes in the profession over the course of 6 years that kind of necessitated a complete rewrite. Can you think of one or two particular aspects of the ethical codes that struck you as like, we really need to kind of flesh this out and provide greater clarity with regard to our ethics?
One in particular that I experienced that and again, I think the best research ideas and the best ideas for publication come from experience in the field daily. And I was confronted with, as many family counselors are, I was confronted with a situation where I was having notes subpoenaed by court for a couple, and one of the couple didn't give consent for the notes to be submitted. So it left me with an ethical dilemma of how do I redact, what do I do in that situation? And so I consulted with attorneys and with other people in the field, and we figured out a course of action. But through that process, I also talked to several other people, many other people actually, who had experienced the same dilemma. And so that really was one that we dealt with pretty directly in the code, in the revision. And so that was one in particular. The other that continues to just cause all kinds of issues in the field is that of quote unquote keeping secrets between family members. And so as we went through this iteration of the code, we were very clear about that we do not keep secrets as family counselors. And so again, I use these 2 points to illustrate that the first one, with regard to the redaction of notes, was kind of a micro issue that I suddenly realized was a huge issue because we started talking amongst ourselves and figured out that that needed to be addressed. The other was a really macro issue that was just a continuation of earlier stuff that we'd already looked at, but we realized that we needed to be more specific and focused in this iteration of the code.
And with regard to keeping secrets, how do you typically broach that with clients to kind of clarify misconceptions or to clearly articulate and offer that informed consent?
With clients, I have that in my informed consent as something that the clients sign off up front, that I define who the client is, that the client is the couple. We talk through that. We discuss what that means. And that while there may be times when, as a part of therapy, that I may talk to them individually, that even in those individual sessions that we have to figure out how the issues that we talk about impact the couple as a whole. Therefore, we're not going to be keeping secrets. And when it's explained up front and that boundary is very clear to the client, I've really not had major issues about that at all. I think the issue has been that in the past, when I've not explained that up front, and when I've not had that in the informed consent, then it becomes much more of a sticky point later. But I've learned, put that in the informed consent.
So it sounds like just that very clear, proactive approach kind of hedges off a lot of issues down the line.
Absolutely. That's the most important thing about informed consent. You're defining the relationship with the client. And I have had several people who are non-counselors look at my informed consent drafts, because I want people outside the counseling field to look at things so that we're not just using counselor words in there that the public doesn't understand. And so that's been a good experience for me to have some people outside counseling look at those forms.
Yeah, that's been my experience too, where it's kind of like if you have a document that seems like legalese, it's almost like a disincentive to read. But something that's very friendly and accessible kind of almost invites that thorough reading because it doesn't seem too jargony.
Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned how your clinical work has informed some of the very practical things that you worked hard to integrate into the new code of ethics that you drafted last year. Are there student issues that you commonly see as your trainees go through practicum and internship that are kind of those common ethical issues that invite maybe some angst, but also encourage a lot of reflection and development?
As the years have progressed, yes, and actually I've seen some changes in some of these, but very recently I have seen that students, and I think the culture as a whole, but I'll focus on students now. We're really geared to look at the desire to have quick change. And so I really work with the students because I do feel like that this is an ethical dilemma that they face, is that they really want quick fixes and clients want quick fixes. And so being able to actually be, as I was saying earlier, be with the client, not rush the client, and be willing to shut out the outside noise. For me, that is an ethical issue, that we have to focus on the client. We have to focus on what's going on with the client. We have to shut out our own personal issues and be directly with that person. So that's very difficult for our students, because they've got so much constant input going on that it's hard for them to slow down, be quiet, be still, and be with the client. In terms of the common ethical dilemmas that students face, I think, again, it boils down to some issues around time, that we have to make sure that they're getting the appropriate supervision, that they may be tempted at times to, and we talk about this very directly, tempted at times to carry notes out of a site and do work at home, that sort of thing, and we have to be very cautious of that. Obviously, we forbid that, but we have to talk to them about dealing with that sort of temptation. Also, I think that client confidentiality is, I want to say it's evolving, not in the sense that we are going to violate client confidentiality, but in terms of we live in such a connected world that sometimes it's hard for the students to plug into what confidentiality really means. And so those are some of the major issues I'm seeing right now with students.
Yeah, I was reading recently that just generationally, that idea of privacy and the acceptance of being okay with certain things just not being private, with, as you alluded to, the nature of the internet, has drastically evolved. How do you broach that topic with your students?
I set that up very carefully. I'm teaching, as I was saying earlier, I'm teaching a master's ethics course. And so we start very generally in that ethics course about what it means to be a counselor professional identity, that you as a counselor are different in many respects from the people, from the public. Therefore, you have different responsibilities. And so these responsibilities include that of keeping clients' information confidential. And so for me, it starts out with really talking to the student about who they are as a counselor, what it means to be a counselor in the community, what it means to be a counselor to the public, and most importantly, what it is for them to be internalizing the identity as a counselor. And so when we do that, when we set that stage, then students are much more able to understand the context of confidentiality and how important it is.
So, as I prepared for this interview, I noticed that a majority of your research over, say, the past 10 or 15 years has been published in the Family Journal. And I was wondering if there was anything in particular that's really made that journal a great landing spot for your work throughout the years.
I have been heavily involved through the years with the International Association of Marriage and Family Counseling, and I love the association. And through my association, or through my affiliation with that association, I've also worked with the journal, and I have a great respect for the journal. I have a great respect for the editor, for Stephen Southern, and for the work that he does, for the integrity that he presents and exhibits as he runs that journal. I also know very closely what the audience is for that journal. And so I like that audience. I like to work with counselors who focus on family issues and with counselors who understand that even when you're working with an individual, you're still working with a family. And so it's been a really good fit for me. And I will say it's not an easy journal to be published in, that it's pretty rigorous in terms of how they edit the articles, how they select articles. And so I also respect that. Sometimes it comes with having to do a lot of rewrites for an article, but at the same time, I respect the integrity that Dr. Southern utilizes as he selects those articles. But for me, it's just been a really good fit through the years.
Well, you also mentioned your active involvement in IAMFC and your love for that association, and you just recently concluded your 3-year term as the association's representative for ACA's Governing Council. And I've got to admit, it wasn't until last year one of my colleagues, Mark Scholl, is also on Governing Council, that I even heard of its existence, and I previously had no idea what it is. So I wonder if for those out in the audience who maybe aren't familiar with ACA's Governing Council, you could talk about just what that entails.
The Governing Council for the American Counseling Association is the equivalent of its board of directors, and so as such, they're responsible for the strategic mission of the organization and the basically the running of the organization. And it's a very large organization with a large budget, very diverse, and I will say that this board is a very hands-on board, works very closely with the executive director, but that board sets the budget. They set the basic direction, as I was saying, of the association. So there are several face-to-face meetings during the year, and the agenda would run up to 300 pages, 400 pages, even before we would have a meeting. So it was a lot of work, and I enjoyed the work, but it was a lot of work. And I felt like it was very rewarding because I feel like the association is doing some very noble and some very good things. But that's the essential function of the Governing Council.
And so for those out there who may be considering becoming a member of ACA or IAMFC, what are some of those noble things that you observed that were kind of in process that those various associations are working toward?
I think that the biggest aspect that I really feel proud of through the years is the advocacy work that we've done, and advocacy at all levels, at the micro level for the clients that we serve, for the entities that we serve, through all the way up through the community and through macro work of political and socio-political sorts of changes, that I've really been touched and impressed through the years with working with these folks who are very willing to devote time and effort and energy, but more than that, they are absolutely putting the needs of clients above their own needs and working, sometimes wrestling with their own personal things regarding advocacy, but always putting clients first. And so the advocacy issues, I think, are probably the closest to my heart. And I think that ACA has done some fantastic things in the last 3 years. We worked with Human Rights Campaign for LGBTQ adolescents who were struggling with their identity. We also did a lot of advocacy with racial, ethnic groups. We did work with immigration. And I'm really proud of that work. And I think that those are the things that make an impact on our clients and society in general. And Rob, let me just add too that it's not, for me, it's not just that the advocacy is outward, but the advocacy is inward in terms of really advocating for our members, that we make sure that they have the resources they need.
Absolutely.
So that they can practice on a day-to-day basis. And we really emphasize wellness and emphasize that they have quality resources that they can use on a day-to-day basis, so they don't feel so isolated and they don't feel as if that they have nothing to work with in terms of research and in terms of having the adequate tools to really carry out their mission as counselors.
You mentioned wellness, which again reminded me of the article I referenced earlier that's, about 10 years old, where you talk about how counselors are so great at taking care of others, but sometimes the worst at taking care of themselves. And now 10 years out, do you think that's still the case, that counselors certainly have a ways to go in taking better care of themselves?
Absolutely. I think that the bottom line is that, and I talk to counselors about this all the time, we're nice people, and so therefore we want to help. And sometimes we get lost in the helping of others. And so I really emphasize to counselors that in order to practice at their full potential and in order to practice ethically, that they must exercise higher level thinking, higher level abilities to conceptualize cases. Therefore, they must take care of themselves in order to do that. So I think that was a fairly new concept 10 years ago. And now, while it's not a new concept, I don't think that we've made that much progress. I think we're talking about it, but I think we still have far to go in terms of actually implementing those strategies.
So now as you look ahead to, say, like the next 5 or 10 years, what are some of those areas that you would hope would no longer be a new concept, or a current challenge that you hope in the future would not be as prevalent as it is today?
My hope would be that the wellness issue would not be as daunting for counselors. I know that that's really aspirational at this point, but we were just talking about that. So that we as a profession integrate absolute wellness strategies that we hold ourselves accountable to and that we hold one another accountable. 10 years out, I would hope that we have moved to a framework whereby we're not terrified by the ethics code, but we do more internal sorts of coaching, internal sorts of interventions, much like medicine, much like the legal profession does, so that if somebody has an infraction, they aren't just immediately drawn up in front of a board and sanctioned, but that we do some internal work with those folks before that level is achieved.
Well, I want to thank you for your time, and as we wrap up, something I've started to do for each of the episodes, because the podcast is called The Reframe, is to ask the guests to think back to a time in their career or their life where they just looked at something in a different way, and that way of reframing really enhanced their perspective on a particular situation. So I was wondering if you would share a reframe from your life with our audience.
Really, I think that the way that I live my life anymore, I try to reframe most everything, because I try to abide by and live by the concepts that if something is, so to speak, a thorn in my flesh, I need to look at that and figure out why it is, and then deal with that in a proactive way and actually embrace that so that I can move forward and learn from that. So I can think back to several situations where even in momentary things, and I'll give an example. I served as president of the Texas Counseling Association, and I learned very quickly that there would be folks in meetings who would have vociferous opinions, and that sometimes those vociferous opinions would not align with our agenda. And one particular day, we were trying to get through our business agenda, and there was a gentleman who was pushing a point, And I suddenly realized that the point that he was pushing, I had to reframe what he was saying to me, because I was hearing in my mind that he's attacking and that he's attacking our agenda, when indeed he was bringing up something that was very important to him and his constituents. And so I had to look at that from the perspective of reframe, that the problems that he was causing were indeed my problem, that I was trying to be too rigid with my agenda and not listening to what the real words were. And frankly, I find that I do that probably, 100 times a day now, where I try to just stop myself, ground myself, be in the moment, figure out what it is that's bothering me, and figure out then why it's bothering me so that I can move forward in a positive way.
The Reframe is a production of the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. Join me next month on The Reframe.